She signed the Alpha King's marriage contract expecting heartbreak. Instead, she woke up carrying his heir. The envelope was on the kitchen table when Lena Ashford came home from her shift at the clinic. Plain white. No postage stamp. Her name written on the front in ink so dark and pressed so deep it looked like someone had been angry when they wrote it. She did not open it right away. She set her bag down by the door. She took off her shoes. She filled the kettle and stood at the counter while it boiled and looked at the envelope from across the room the way you look at an animal you are not sure about. She had a particular relationship with bad news. She did not run toward it or away from it. She let it arrive at its own speed, and she waited, and when she was ready she received it. She made tea. She sat down. She opened it. The letter was from the former office of King Caden Voss, ruler of the Ashton Kingdom and recognized sovereign of the 4 unified Pact territories. 3 paragraphs. Clean legal language. The kind that uses many careful words to say something very simple. What it said, when she removed all the formality from it, was this: her father had signed a contract 2 years before he died, and that contract had promised his eldest daughter to the king in a formal union, and the time for that union had now arrived. She read it once. She read it again. She set the letter flat on the table and pressed her palm over it. Not to hide it. Not to deny it. Just to keep it still, the way you hold something still while you are deciding what to do with it. Lena was 24 years old. She had not spent any of those years expecting good fortune, which had made her efficient and had also made her, in certain quiet moments, lonely in a way she did not examine too closely. Her mother had left when she was 11. Quietly, without a dramatic final scene or a proper explanation, the way some people live, not with the door slamming but with the specific absence that you only notice after enough time has passed that the absence is the new condition. Her father had spent the next decade being a man who was good-hearted and completely impractical in the ways that mattered most, which meant he loved his daughters genuinely and managed the family finances the way someone plays a card game they have never fully understood. When he died, 18 months ago, he left Lena a house with a leaking roof, a younger sister named Clara who was 19 and in her first year at university, a medical debt that had accumulated interest with no concern for grief, and a pact that had quietly stopped protecting them the week after the funeral. Not cruelly. Just quietly. The way water stops flowing when there is no longer a source to drive it. Lena had managed. She always managed. She worked 2 clinic shifts per week, drove 40 minutes each way, kept the household accounts in a notebook in the kitchen drawer, and had learned a very efficient relationship with the word no. She did not spend money she did not have. She did not invest hope in outcomes she could not verify. She had become, over the past year and a half, a person of calibrated expectations and very little surplus. She had heard of King Caden Voss. Everyone had. He was 29 years old and had been king since he was 22, which meant he had spent 7 years making decisions that other men spent decades avoiding. He had unified 4 fractured Pact territories not through grand speeches or dramatic shows of force but through a specific combination of precision and patience that had left his opponents with nothing coherent to argue against. He was known to be intelligent. He was known to be controlled. He was known to have a particular kind of quiet authority that people described, when they were being honest, as the most uncomfortable thing in any room he entered. He had also been in 3 public unions in 6 years. All 3 had ended without scandal, without anger, without any visible wreckage. He arranged things with the same clean efficiency with which he ended them. Both processes appeared, from the outside, to happen in the same register: practical, managed, concluded. Which told Lena one thing clearly: she would go, she would serve the contracted period, and then she would be arranged away just as tidily as the 3 before her. Fine. She had done harder things. The letter requested her presence in 4 days. Not demanded. Requested. As though she had a real choice. She noted this precision. It was either a courtesy or a calculation, and she could not determine which yet, and she would not pretend to know until she had more information. She called Clara that evening. Clara answered on the second ring, the way she always did, as though she had been sitting next to the phone waiting for it. She was like that, present and eager and still in possession of the belief that things would work out, which was a belief Lina had stopped being able to afford somewhere around age 14, but that she was deeply, privately grateful Clara still carried for both of them. "I need to tell you something," Lina said. "And I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." Clara listened. She did not stay quiet long after Lina finished. "You cannot go," Clara said. "If I do not go, the park protection on the house lapses immediately. The medical debt becomes due in full within 60 days. Your university placement depends on the park scholarship, and the scholarship requires the protection to be active." "Lina, I know. You cannot give up 2 years of your life for me." "I am not giving anything up," Lina said, which was mostly true. "I am making a practical decision. There is a meaningful difference between those two things." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then, very softly, with the particular gentleness she used when she thought Lina needed it and Lina would not admit it, "Are you scared?" Lina thought about it honestly, the way she always thought about things. Not performing calm, not dismissing the question, but genuinely checking. "No," she said. "I stopped being scared of things that are already happening. There is not much point." She arrived at the king's estate on a grey Tuesday morning. The car that had been sent for her was a plain black vehicle with a driver who was polite and did not make conversation, which she appreciated deeply. She watched the landscape change from the small familiar roads of her town to a long gated drive lined with old trees that had been growing long enough that their branches crossed over the road and made a green tunnel of the entrance. The estate itself did not perform impressiveness. That was the first thing she registered, and she registered it with something close to respect. There were no excessive flags or formal guards arranged to intimidate visitors. The building was large and stone and very old and said everything it needed to say about permanence simply by existing. It was the kind of structure that made you aware, not that you were small, but that you were temporary. That everything was. She thought, so is everything, and it had never yet stopped her from being useful. A woman named Petra met her at the entrance. Close-cropped gray hair, a tablet in one hand, a manner that was so efficiently tuned toward function that friendliness would have been a waste of both their time. "The king will meet with you in the study," Petra said, already moving. "He prefers to stand during first meetings. If you prefer to sit, tell me now and I will make arrangements." "I will stand," Lina said. Petra glanced at her sideways. Brief. Unreadable in a way that suggested Petra was actually reading a great deal. "Right," she said. She was taken through rooms that were functional rather than decorative. Clean stone floors, good natural light, furniture that was present because it was useful and not because it was meant to create an impression. There was art on some walls, but none of it was performing wealth. She liked this. She liked that a place confident enough in what it was did not feel the need to tell you what it was. The study was on the east side of the building. 3 walls of bookshelves, floor to ceiling. She looked at them immediately, because books told her more about a person than any arranged meeting could. The books were worn at the spines in the way that only happens with repeated reading. Some were pulled slightly forward from being lifted down often. Some had paper markers in them. A few were stacked horizontally in the way of books that are used as reference and reached for frequently. These were not decorative books. These were not books purchased to fill a room. Someone in this study actually read. She had perhaps 30 seconds alone before the door opened. Caden Voss did not perform an entrance. He walked in the way you walk into a room that belongs to you, not because he was displaying ownership but because that was simply the truth and his body knew it. He was taller than she had expected, dark-haired, with a face that was precisely assembled, a strong jaw, a mouth that was composed rather than warm, eyes that were grey-green and extremely present. He was wearing a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to his forearms and he looked, entirely against her expectation, like a man in the middle of a working day who had not known he was meant to perform for an audience. He stopped when he saw her. Not dramatically. Just a natural pause. The kind that happens when a person registers something and their mind catches up with their eyes. He said, "Lina Ashford." Not a question. A confirmation. He was verifying that the person standing in his study matched something in his mind, and she understood that what was in his mind had been there for some time. Yes, she said. He did not offer a hand. He crossed the room to the window and stood near it, and the position was not aggressive or symbolic. It was just where he stood. Where the light was. Where a person stands when they are thinking and looking at the same time. I want to be direct with you from the beginning, he said. I prefer that, she said. Your father's contract is legally valid. It was signed with his full consent and in his right mind at the time of signing. I want you to know clearly that I am aware you were given no choice in that. No, she agreed. I am not going to apologize for the contract existing. But I would like to explain what I am actually proposing, in real terms, so that you can make a decision that is as informed as possible. She crossed her arms. Not defensively. It was cold in the study and she was paying very close attention, and her body did that when she was paying very close attention. Go ahead. He told her. In clear sequence, without unnecessary softening. A public marriage. A 2-year term. During those 2 years she would hold the full title and all the responsibilities it carried. She would be treated with genuine respect in all public and private contexts. She would have staff, resources, and complete access to the household appropriate to her position. At the end of 2 years, if she chose to leave, the marriage would be dissolved quietly and without damage to her standing. She would leave with a full financial settlement. Clara's university education would be funded completely through completion. The family's medical debt would be cleared entirely. Park protection on the house would remain active for 10 years regardless of her final decision. And if I refuse, she said. Today. He held her gaze without flinching. The contract becomes unenforceable if you refuse it to my face and in my presence. Your father signed it. You did not. But the protections and settlements I described do not apply if you refuse. She absorbed this carefully. She ran through it the way she ran through the household accounts, in order, without sentiment, looking for what was accurate versus what was convenient to believe. The offer was reasonable. The stakes without it were real. He was not threatening her with anything she was not already facing. He was also being completely honest about all of it, which was more than she had expected and which told her something she needed to know. The political benefit to you, she said. Tell me what it is specifically. He described it. An alliance signal. Territory agreements that had stalled. A particular message to the other pack leaders that required a demonstration rather than a statement. All of it plausible. All of it true, as far as she could assess. And there was a pause before he answered. 1/2 second of something behind his eyes going quiet before he answered. She caught it because she had been watching for exactly that kind of pause. She filed it away in the same place she filed the things that needed more time. I will sign, she said. He looked at her. This look. She would come to know it later, the specific quality of his attention when she had surprised him in a way that also confirmed something. He had not expected agreement this quickly or this simply, with this complete absence of visible distress. You are certain, he said. I did the math, she said. Which was exactly what she had told Clara. She watched his face to see if he found it cold or strange. He did not. He found it, she thought, strangely recognizable. All right, he said. The paperwork took 40 minutes. Lena read every line. Caden sat at the far end of the table and walked through a separate document while she read, which she assessed, after watching him for 10 minutes, was genuine. He was not performing patience, he actually had things to do. She found this more comfortable than if he had watched her. She signed at the bottom. He countersigned. Petra collected the documents with the efficiency of a person who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Dinner that evening was small, herself and Caden and 2 of his senior people. Oliver, who was 60-something and had eyes like a crow and said very little but missed nothing. And Diane, who managed external relations and who looked at Lena during the soup course with open, unsentimental assessment and then looked away, and Lena understood she had passed something without being told what it was. She ate and said the right things and listened more than she spoke and kept her heart somewhere safe and managed, for the entire evening, not to want a single thing she was not contractually going to receive. Petra showed her to the East Wing rooms afterward. They were large and quiet and had a window seat looking out over a garden that was unusual, clearly tended with care but allowed to look slightly wild. As though whoever managed it had decided that control and nature did not need to be enemies. She stood in the doorway for a moment. On the table near the window, in a pale green vase, there were flowers. Cream-colored, simple, without a note. She stood and looked at them. She had expected a cold room. The minimum of effort, the transaction clearly communicated through the space itself. She had not expected flowers that were too quiet to be performative, that suggested someone had thought specifically about a person arriving alone in a strange house. She washed her face. She changed for bed. She was moving down the corridor when she caught two words from outside, staff passing, voices low, not meant for her. He chose her. Not surprised. Knowing. The way you say something you have understood for some time. She stood in the bathroom with the tap running and her face still damp, and she held those three words very carefully, the way you hold something that is fragile before you have decided where to put it. He chose her. Not by default. Not simply because the name on a piece of paper happened to belong to her. Chose. With intention. For reasons she had not yet been told. She turned off the tap. She went to bed in the room with the flowers and the wild garden view and the deep, steady awareness that the 2-year calculation she had made at her kitchen table was already, by some mechanism she had not yet identified, more complicated than she had planned for. When she closed her eyes, the last thing in her mind was not the contract. It was the pause before he answered. 3 months in, the title stopped feeling like a borrowed quote. Not because Lina had stopped being aware of it. She was always aware of it, the way she was aware of the weather, simply part of the conditions she was moving through and had to account for. What changed was that she stopped bracing against it. She wore it, and it sat differently on her, and sometime in the middle of the 3rd month she caught herself thinking of the East Wing as her rooms without adding any qualifier to the thought. She knew the building now the way you know a place you have lived long enough, not by studying a map but because your feet had memorized the turns. She knew that Petra arrived each morning at 7 and departed at 9 in the evening. She knew that the main hall was quietest in the 30 minutes between 4 and 5, when the staff changed shifts and the formal day wound down. She knew that the kitchen produced extra tea on cold rainy days without being asked, and that George, the garden keeper, 60s, weathered, a man of extreme economy when it came to words, left small bundles of rosemary near her window on cold mornings, and that she had never asked about it and he had never explained it, and that this arrangement suited them both precisely. She knew that Caden read before anyone else in the house was properly awake. She knew he ate at the same chair at the same table, and that he had a particular habit when thinking deeply of pressing 2 fingers very lightly against the side of his jaw, without appearing to notice he was doing it. She knew the specific quality of his silence when he was working versus the quality of his silence when he was in the same room and paying attention to something other than the document in front of him. She had not set out to learn any of this. But patterns were what she noticed, and a household had patterns, and the longer she moved through this one the more it arranged itself into the particular kind of clarity that is harder to step back from than confusion is. The court had its own education. In the 4th week she had been introduced to Caden's extended political circle at a formal dinner for 16. She felt the room calculating her from the moment she walked through the door. It was a distributed thing, spread across multiple people and multiple conversations simultaneously, like a kind of collective audit being performed without any single person organizing it. She ate calmly and spoke when spoken to and smiled at precisely the moments that required a smile and went to bed afterward with a headache that was entirely informational rather than distressing. The women of the court were the most complex variable. Most of them were guarded but essentially fair. A few were genuinely warm toward her in ways that felt unattached to strategy. One was not. Caroline Heir was the wife of a senior counsel advisor. She was perhaps 10 years older than Lina, and she wore her status with the kind of ease that comes from having occupied the same position in a room for long enough that she had stopped being able to imagine the room without her in the center of it. She had identified Lina as a structural disruption within days of her arrival, and she had begun to manage the disruption through small, careful, deniable actions. A poor sitting assignment at a public event placed Lina far from the significant conversations without being obviously punitive. An invitation to a private gathering arrived 2 days after the event, the apology for the delay so smooth it was almost impossible to attach blame to it. A comment during a group dinner about how charming it must be to come from a smaller community, where everything is so much more personal, is delivered in a tone that was too pleasant to openly object to. Lina did not react to any of it. She watched. She listened. She traced the information channels that ran through the code the way she traced account records at the clinic, following the flow until she found the source. The information that reached Caroline always moved through one specific intermediary, an advisor named Hugh, who was mid-40s and believed himself more discreet than he was. She observed the pattern for 3 weeks. Then she waited for a specific type of occasion. A charitable fund that Caroline had organized for the previous spring had a discrepancy in its distribution records. It was not hidden. It had simply not been noticed because nobody had put 2 specific documents in the same room at the same time. The discrepancy was, on its own, moderately significant. In the current context, with the right people looking in the right direction, it was considerably more significant. Lina arranged for 2 specific people to be in the same room on a particular afternoon. She did not manufacture the conversation. She created the conditions for it and then was not present when it occurred. Within 10 days, Caroline's dinner comments had ceased. The invitations arrived correctly. The sitting at public events was appropriate. Oliver noticed. She understood this because he began including her in morning briefings that were not strictly necessary for her position. He described the inclusion as a matter of logistics and convenience, and she accepted that framing without disagreeing, because it cost her nothing to let him keep the explanation and it was more useful to her to simply be in the room. She started attending. She said little. She absorbed everything. In the 5th month, a boundary dispute between 2 neighboring territories arrived on the briefing table. It had been running unresolved for 2 years. Each party had submitted documentation. Each set of documentation supported the opposite conclusion. Caden had been reviewing it for a week without finding a path forward. Oliver had added context. Diane had summarized the political considerations. Lina read all of it in an evening. She came to the next briefing with one question, which she addressed to Oliver: has anyone compared the 2 sets of documentation simultaneously rather than reviewing each one independently? A pause in the room. Nobody had. She requested both full document sets and walked through them that afternoon, alone in the library, with the 2 maps laid side by side. The boundary discrepancy traced back to a surveying error from 40 years ago that both parties had inherited and compounded, and neither had ever caught because the error only became visible when you looked at both records at once. She wrote a single-page summary of her findings and left it on Oliver's desk without comment. The dispute was formally resolved within 2 weeks. Oliver said nothing to her directly. But from the following week, documents arrived on her desk before they went elsewhere. The night in the library happened in the 6th week, when Lina woke at 2 in the morning and could not return to sleep. This was not unusual for her. She had a long-standing arrangement with insomnia. It arrived, she did not fight it, she waited it out. She had come downstairs for water and ended up in the library, which was smaller and warmer than the study and had a window seat looking out over the front gate rather than the garden. She pulled a book from the shelf without fully looking at what she was taking and had been sitting in the low lamplight for perhaps 20 minutes when the door opened. Caden stopped in the doorway. He was in a dark pullover and plain trousers with no formality anywhere about him. This was the first time she had seen him without the assembled quality he wore in working hours, not stiff exactly, but always composed, always in some small way arranged. This was what he looked like when he had stopped managing his appearance for the day. She found it unexpectedly interesting. "I did not know you came here," she said. "I did not know you did either," he said. He crossed the room and sat in the chair nearest the window. Not the farthest one. She registered this and did not comment on it. "What are you reading?" he asked. She checked the spine. She had picked it without looking. a historical record of land disputes in the Western Territories. Published 60 years ago. The near-invisible thing she had begun to recognize as his version of amusement moved briefly across his face. A compelling choice for 2 in the morning. I was not reading it, she said. I was just holding it. That is an unusually honest answer. I do not have much to gain from pretending with you, she said. You already know why I am here. You do not need me to perform. He held her gaze for a moment. Then, in the same flat informational tone he used for everything, as though it were ordinary, my mother could not sleep either. Most nights. She let the sentence rest exactly where he had placed it. She did not push on it, did not open the door behind it. She understood instinctively that he had placed it not to invite questions but because it was a thing he had chosen to say, simply, without needing it to go anywhere. They stayed in the library for over an hour. They did not talk for most of it. He read something, a thin document rather than a book, and she held her irrelevant land history and watched the gate and listened to the house settle in the way old buildings settle at night, which is its own kind of company. When she finally stood to leave, she paused in the doorway. Caden. He looked up. When I arrived, she said. The flowers in the room. Thank you. A pause that was too controlled to be casual. I will let the staff know you noticed, he said. She walked upstairs with the specific and quiet certainty that it had not been the staff. She discovered the park payments the following morning, in the estate's financial records that Petra had made available to her for household planning purposes. A regular monthly transfer to her father's old park, originating from Caden's personal accounts rather than the estate's former budget. Predating her arrival by 4 months. No contractual basis. No explanation attached to the record. She sat with this for a full week. She turned it over carefully. She thought about what it could mean and what it required and what it said, specifically, about the person who had done it. He had known, before she arrived, that her family had been left unprotected after her father's death. He had simply and quietly arranged to fix it. Without telling her. Without recording it in any way that could be read as leverage. Without attaching any expectation to it at all. She thought about the pause before he had answered her question about his political benefit. She thought about the flowers. She thought, there is more here than I was told. In the 7th month, a complication arrived in the form of Alpha Grant Hollis. He was the leader of the Northern Caldwell Park, mid-30s, large, carrying himself with the physical confidence of a man who had never encountered a problem that size and volume could not eventually resolve. He arrived at the estate with 2 advisors and a sealed letter addressed to Oliver, and the letter contained a formal claim that Lena had been previously promised to him, that he had documentation, and that he was requesting a council hearing to establish his prior right. Petra delivered this to Lena with the calm of a person reading a weather report. Lena's first response was not fear. It was the specific quiet sharpening that arrived in her during real difficulty, every unnecessary thing falling away, leaving only what mattered, in order. She had felt it when her father's doctors had run out of options. She had felt it when the bank sent the first letter about the debt. She recognized it as a tool she reached for because it worked, and she reached for it now. She found Caden within the hour. He was already working through it when she arrived. The folder on his desk was open. He had begun before she came to him, because he had known she would come and because working on something before you were asked to was the way he operated. Thursday is the hearing, he said. The council will review the competing claims. I want to speak at the hearing, she said. He went very still. That would be irregular. I know. He looked at her. Held her gaze. Something in the room shifted in the way it sometimes shifted between them, not a performance, not a negotiation, just 2 people reading each other past the surface. I will arrange it, he said. She spent 2 full days preparing. She pulled her family's records. She read both the original Voss contract and everything she could find relating to Grant Hollis and his claim. She borrowed the relevant documentation from Oliver's desk without asking and returned it without comment. She found 3 things. The first was a date on Grant's primary documentation that placed the alleged arrangement after her father had entered the medical care that had rendered him legally incapacitated. She had the medical records. The second was a supersession clause buried in the third schedule of divorce contract, the kind of legal language that sits quietly until it becomes suddenly necessary, that explicitly voided any competing arrangement involving the same party during the contract period. The third was a letter misfiled under her mother's maiden name in the estate archive, written by Grant's own legal advisor to Grant at the time of the claimed arrangement, stating that the understanding with the Ashford family has not yet been formalized and remains unconfirmed. 3 facts. Unambiguous. In order. She walked into the council chamber on Thursday in a plain dark dress and her mother's small gold earrings and stood at the open end of the horseshoe where the person being addressed traditionally stood, not the person making an argument. 12 alphas in their chairs. Grant Hollis across from her, certain and polished. She let him speak first. He was organized and confident and presented his case in the manner of a man who has rehearsed arriving at a conclusion and expects the conclusion to be received. She let the room absorb it. Then she spoke. She placed the 3 facts in the room. Clean, sequential, unambiguous. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform conviction. She simply stated what was true in the order that made it clearest, and when she stopped speaking she was completely still and let the silence do its work. Grant began to speak. Verified, said Oliver, from the far end of the horseshoe. He had been waiting. He had known what she was going to find because he had known she was capable of finding it, and he had positioned himself to speak that one word at the exact moment it would carry the most weight. The council voted 8-4 in her favor. She thanked the room in a single sentence and walked out. In the corridor she found the alcove she had identified earlier in the week, a small recess where 2 walls met at an angle that made a quiet pocket. She stood there with her back to the wall and her eyes closed and breathed, carefully and completely, for exactly 60 seconds. She had learned this from the clinic, 60 seconds to be a person, and then you went back. She went back. Caden met her on the stairs. He was coming up as she came down and they stopped, facing each other on the midpoint. He did not say well done. He was someone who understood that well done, said to a person who had just done something difficult, was almost always more about the speaker than the recipient. He said, I want to renegotiate the contract. She stared at him. You want to change the terms the day I spent 2 days defending them. You defended your position, he said. I want to change what the position is. She looked at his face. The wall behind his eyes was down. She had watched it go down during the hearing, while she was speaking, and it had not come back up. What was behind it was not soft. It was just, direct. Unmanaged. The thing he looked like when he stopped arranging himself. What does renegotiation mean? She said. It means 2 years is the wrong number, he said. I want to discuss removing the number entirely. The corridor was quiet around them. Give me time to think about it, she said. Take what you need, he said, and stepped aside so she could pass, and she walked on without looking back. She took 3 days. On the first night in the library she was ruthlessly honest with herself about the fact that she had been building careful walls for 3 months and that the walls were not, she now admitted, as structurally sound as she had believed them to be. On the second night she sat with the specific inventory of things she had noticed without meaning to notice, the flowers, the library, the park payments, the document that arrived on her desk the day before it went anywhere else, and she acknowledged what they added up to. On the third night she acknowledged what she was beginning to want. She did not answer him yet. But she knew, by the third night, what she was going to answer. The rival was gone and the formal hearing was recorded in the council document, and Lena moved through the following days with the particular awareness of someone who has named a thing to themselves and is waiting to see what the naming requires. Caden had asked for a renegotiation. She had asked for time. Both of those facts sat in the air between them like weather that had arrived and not yet decided what to do with itself. She threw herself into work. Not as avoidance, but with a new depth of engagement, because working deeply was the way she had always thought through the things that mattered. Problems clarified themselves when her hands were busy with other problems. She had learned this about herself at 16, sitting at her father's kitchen table doing accounts while her mind worked through something else entirely, and the pattern had never changed. Oliver had begun including her in the pre-briefing conversations, the ones that happened in his office before the formal morning sessions, where the actual shape of decisions was discussed before they were formally presented. He did this without announcement, simply expanding the meeting invitation one morning to include her name and continuing to include it. She attended. She listened. When she spoke, Oliver listened back. He had a specific quality of attention when someone said something he considered worth having, a stillness, a slight adjustment in his posture, the crow eyes focusing differently. She began receiving it consistently by the third week. Diane brought her into external meetings. A delegation from the Northern Coast Territories came in the 8th month to discuss trade access arrangements that had been under informal discussion for over a year. Lina spent 2 evenings reading the background documentation and prepared 3 questions. She asked all 3 at the appropriate moments. The delegation's primary representative, a careful and experienced man named Philip who had been managing diplomatic meetings for 3 decades, looked at her differently after the second question than he had before the first. The meeting concluded with an agreement. Diane told Oliver afterward that it was the fastest comparable outcome in 8 years. In those same months, something happened in the court that she had not anticipated. She had begun to be known. Not as Cadence contracted arrangement, that was the category she had arrived in and expected to remain in. She began to be known as herself. As the person who had handled the Hollis hearing. As the person who had found the 40-year-old surveying error. As the person who had restructured the fund review process. These things were spoken about in the corridors of the estate and in the rooms of the court, and they were spoken about with a specificity that had nothing to do with her title and everything to do with her work. She noticed this. She sat with what it meant. It meant that she had built something here. Not a performance of something. Not a temporary arrangement that would dissolve when the contract did. Something actual, constructed out of real materials, over real time, in the real world. She thought about what it would mean to leave it. She did not follow that thought all the way to its end. Not yet. She fired it and moved on. In the 10th month, she found the documents. She had been reviewing estate records as part of the monthly audit she had begun conducting herself, because no one else was doing it with the depth of attention she applied. She found a document that had been misfiled, simple, probably not intentional, the kind of thing that happens in paper archives when staff change and filing systems are learned secondhand. What the document was mattered more than where it had been placed. It was a medical record. Cadence. From 7 years ago, when he had been 22 and newly king. A significant illness, managed and fully resolved, but serious enough at the time that succession questions had been raised internally and answered when the medical situation resolved. The record included a note from the primary physician about the hereditary considerations of the condition, written for reference in case the situation recurred. In the margin of the physician's note, in a different handwriting, was a reference to a separate document. She recognized the document number. She had found the bloodline specification 3 weeks earlier while researching something unrelated. 3 lines of old language, naming her maternal line in connection with the Ashton succession, compatibility language of the kind that appeared in old Park traditions, which most people had either forgotten or considered ceremonial. She had read it twice and set it aside in the part of her mind where she kept the things she was not yet sure what to do with. Now the physician's record and the bloodline specification were connected, and the connection told her something she had been circling without fully naming. The contract had not been random. It had been specific. Her family specifically. Her maternal line specifically. The targeting had happened before she arrived, before Caden had ever seen her, on the basis of an inherited characteristic she had not chosen and had not known about. She sat down at the archive table. She went through it the way she went through everything, in order, without decoration, with the discipline of a person who has learned that panic is always less useful than clarity. He had chosen her. She had known this since the first night. But he had chosen her before he knew anything about her. Before the library at 2 in the morning. Before the boundary dispute map. Before the hearing. Before 15 months of accumulation had produced the specific person she was in this estate now. He had chosen a name on a specification. And then, she made herself hold the rest of it honestly. 15 months had happened. And the person she had come to know over those months was not consistent with the person who would continue to treat a human being as a specification after that human being had walked into his study and been, simply, a person. What was consistent was someone who had begun with one framework and had moved, through the accumulation of real contact, into a completely different one. She needed to hear it from him. She thought about how to approach it for 3 days, managing the surface of those days with her usual steadiness while the real work happened underneath. Then she walked into the study one evening when the day had finished and he had the specific openness of someone transitioning out of their working mind. He looked up when she entered. She stood in the center of the room. "I found the bloodline specification," she said. "And the physician's record it is connected to." He did not look away. He did not arrange his expression. He sat with what she had said exactly as it was, and she watched his face and found in the quality of his stillness not evasion but something closer to relief, the quiet relief of a person who has been carrying something for a long time and has been found out and is done carrying it. "Yes," he said. "You knew before I arrived exactly who I was. What my bloodline represented." "Yes." She nodded once. "Then tell me what happened between that knowledge and now. Not the version you would give the council. The actual version." He was quiet for a long time. The evening light through the window was low and the room felt contained, 2 people in a small space with a large amount of honesty required. He told her. He described the succession problem, the physician's note, the way the specification had pointed to a practical solution. He described what he had intended when he had arranged the contract. He described the first day in the study and the specific thing that had shifted when she had done the math out loud and not apologized for it and had been, simply, a person occupying her own situation. "I could not find a way back to treating you as a practical solution after that," he said. "I tried, in the beginning. It would have been cleaner." She held his gaze. "You should have told me. On the first day." "Yes," he said. "I calculated that it would affect your decision and I wanted you to make the decision based on what was actually in front of you rather than what was behind it. That was wrong. I made a decision that was mine to make and it was wrong to make it for you." She was quiet. She held the accounting. He had withheld something she had a right to know. He had admitted this without deflection or qualification. He had not contextualized it out of being wrong. She had known people who could not do that. She filed the distinction. "I am going to think about this," she said. "I know," he said. "All of it. The beginning and the now and everything in between." "That is what you should do," he said. She walked out. She went to the library and sat in the window seat in the dark without turning on a lamp and she thought for 2 hours. She thought about her father, who had also made decisions without telling her and had also loved her genuinely, and about how those 2 things had coexisted in him because he was a complete person rather than a simple one. She thought about what it meant that something could begin as a transaction and become real. She thought about whether the realness was contingent on the beginning being clean. She concluded, honestly, that it was not. She thought about the flowers on the first night. Placed there by someone who had already decided that the transaction was not the whole of it. She came out of the library not with a resolution but with something more useful, the specific question she needed to answer. Not whether the beginning had been wrong. He had acknowledged it was wrong and she had acknowledged it with him and the accounting was complete. The question was whether what existed now, in this estate where she had built 15 months of actual life, was its own real thing. Not contingent on where it had started. She believed it was. She took 3 more days to be certain. During those 3 days she continued to work and to attend briefings and to manage the correspondence on her desk, and underneath all of that she was asking the question over and over in the way she asked important questions, not seeking the answer she preferred but pressing toward the true one. The true one arrived on the 3rd morning. She was at her desk reading a report on the Northern Territories when it settled into her with the quiet finality of something that has been arriving for a long time and has now completed its arrival. She put the report down. She sat for a moment. Then she picked it up and finished reading it, because the work was real and the answer was real and both things could be true at the same time. She went to him that evening. "I accept the renegotiation," she said. "All right," he said. "On one condition." He waited. "We write the new terms together," she said. "Not you proposing and me responding. Both of us at the table, with equal authority over every word." He held her gaze. The near warmth she had learned to read across 15 months moved across his face. "Agreed," he said. They sat down together that evening with 2 chairs at the table and they began. The border conflict came in the 9th month without a great deal of warning, which Lina had come to understand was simply how border conflicts worked. The escalation had been visible in the documentation for 3 weeks, the slow thickening of language in the formal exchanges, the particular pattern of short messages that meant the people sending them had run out of things to say and were not ready to admit it. When Caden told her over breakfast one morning that he would need to go himself, she was not surprised. She was also, she noticed, not afraid of the absence the way she might have been 3 months ago. Something had shifted in the way she held his presence in the household. It had gone from being a variable she was accounting for to being, simply, a fact of where she was. He was expected back in 5 days. The first 2 days passed without incident. The estate ran the way it always ran, Petra managing the household logistics with the efficiency of a person for whom efficiency was a personal value rather than a job requirement, the staff maintaining their patterns, the external communications being handled through Oliver. On the 3rd day, Oliver came to her after the morning briefing with a question that should technically have gone to Petra but had arrived on her side of the table instead. She answered it. She did not make a point of the redirect. On the 4th day, 2 things arrived on her desk simultaneously, a resource allocation decision from the outer territories and a question about a diplomatic response that was time-sensitive. She walked through both in the morning and sent her responses through Oliver, who forwarded them without editing them. She noted this. It told her something about what Oliver had been directed to do in Caden's absence. By the 7th day, she was running the morning briefings. There was no announcement. No formal transfer of authority. It happened the way things happened in this house, through the accumulation of small practical choices that each made sense individually and added up to something significant collectively. The staff routed things to her because she was the person in the building whose responses moved the most efficiently. Oliver included her in the conversations that required the most substantive thinking. Diane began copying her on external correspondence that was above the purely administrative level. She managed it all. She worked through a complicated interterritorial resource dispute that had been suspended pending Caden's return and resolved it with a proposal that both parties agreed to within 48 hours. She handled a staffing situation in the household that had been generating friction for 2 weeks and resolved it in a single conversation with the relevant people by the simple mechanism of being clear about what the actual problem was rather than discussing its symptoms. On the 8th day she sat in the study, at Caden's desk, finishing the last of the day's correspondence, and she paused and looked around the room, the bookshelves, the worn spines, the window with the wide garden visible beyond it, and she understood something that she had been understanding slowly over the course of 9 days. She had not been managing this house because she was covering an absence. She had been managing it because she was present. Because she was here and had been here for 9 months and had built a genuine working relationship with every person in this building and had earned, through consistent and serious engagement with every task she had been given, the specific kind of trust that does not require a title to be real. She thought about what that meant. She thought about the fact that she had done all of it, all 9 days, every decision, every document, every conversation, in a state of continuous quiet hope that when the car came up the drive he would be all right. That was not math. She was done pretending it was. On the 9th evening she heard the car. She was at the window before the conscious decision to move. She watched the car stop on the front drive and the door open and she saw him get out, and she saw immediately, in the economy of his movement, in the slight accommodation his body was making, that something had happened. She was in the entrance hall when he came through the door. The cut above his eye was recent and properly closed. The way he held his left arm, fractionally away from his side, toward her ribs. She crossed the distance between them and her hands were at his face, checking the cut, assessing, clinical instinct from years at the clinic, before she had processed the action as a decision. He went completely still. She finished the check. She stepped back. 3 ribs, he said. The cut is shallow. You were in direct conflict. Briefly. It is handled. He looked at her. His expression was doing something she had not seen from him in a direct encounter before, not in the study, not in the library, not in the hearing. Something below the usual surface, fully visible. The expression of a person who has come home to find someone waiting, and has not expected to find it, and does not know quite what to do with the finding. She walked to the study. She sat down. She picked up a document. She read the same line 8 times. She set the document down and put her hands flat on the desk and sat in the quiet of the study and was honest with herself in the way she had been being honest with herself for 9 days in the background of everything else. She wanted him to be all right. Not abstractly. Not as a practical matter. In the specific, physical, animal way that bypasses calculation entirely and simply is. She let that be true. She did not argue with it. She went to find him that evening. His rooms were in the north wing, 3 corridors from hers. She knocked. He said, "Come in." He was in the chair by the window with a lamp on and a document in his hands. He looked up when she entered, and there was something in the way he looked up, the specific quality of his attention when she entered rooms, which she had noticed and fired and not examined directly until now, that said something she did not need to translate. She sat in the other chair. She told him plainly, she had run the house for 9 days, Oliver had brought his briefings on the 3rd day, she had directed to Oliver because that was the efficient part, and she wanted to tell him that before he read it in someone else's summary. "I arranged it before I left," he said. "I told Oliver to bring everything to you." She absorbed this. "You trusted me with it before you left?" "Yes." "Without telling me?" "You would have done the same work regardless of whether I mentioned it," he said. "And I did not want to give you the weight of my expectation on top of the work itself." She sat with this for a moment. The distinction he was making was a real one. She recognized the kind of thinking that produced it. "I want to tell you something," she said. He waited. "When the car came up the drive tonight," she said, "and I saw you getting out, I understood something I had been not understanding for a while." She looked at the dark garden outside his window. "I did not spend 9 days managing your house because I was capable of it. I did it because it was yours and you were not here and I wanted it to be whole when you came back." The room was quiet. She turned back from the window and looked at him. "That is different from Matt," she said. "Yes," he said. His voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of something held carefully. "It is. I am going to need 3 days," she said. "And then I am going to give you your answer." He nodded, and the quality of the nod, patient, undemanding, with no performance of patience in it, was, she recognized, its own kind of answer about the kind of person he had been for 15 months. She went upstairs. The 3 days were not about uncertainty. She was not uncertain. The 3 days were about something more specific. She needed the decision to be made from a place of genuine freedom rather than accumulated situation. She had spent too much of her life making decisions because circumstances had narrowed the options until only one remained. She was not going to do that with this. She spent the first day working. She handled correspondence, met with Diane about an upcoming external visit, and sat with Oliver for 2 hours reviewing the border conflict outcomes. She stayed entirely in the practical world and let the other thing rest beneath it. By evening she understood clearly that what she felt was not circumstance. It did not change when she was doing something else. It was simply there. She spent the second day thinking about what she wanted her life to look like. Not this life specifically. Her life in general. The kind of life she had not let herself plan for in the years of managing the immediate and the urgent. She thought about it carefully and without flinching and found that the picture she arrived at contained, in every version she tried, this house and this work and this person. She spent the third morning in the garden. She walked it the way she had walked it once before, slowly, looking at the deliberate wired structure of it, the things placed to grow in exactly the direction they needed to. At the far end she sat on the bench near the east wall and watched the light change in the old trees along the border of the property and thought about the specific word for the thing she was feeling. She found the word. She went inside. She came down the stairs before the house was properly awake on the fourth morning and he was in the entrance hall. He was simply there, near the window, present in the way he was always present, not performing waiting, not arranged, just himself in the space. He turned when he heard her. She stopped on the bottom step. Yes, she said. He crossed the hall. He stopped in front of her and looked at her with an expression she had no prior reference for because she had never seen his face without any management in it before now, no distance, no arrangement, just the direct and enormous and slightly startled quality of a person receiving something they had hoped for long enough that receiving it required a moment to become real. She placed her hand against his chest. He put his hand over hers and held it there, and the house was quiet around them, and outside the garden was coming into the morning light. They stayed like that. For a while. For longer than was strictly necessary. Which was, she thought, the whole point. She knew for 4 days before she said anything. This was not evasion. She had lived her whole life moving from feeling directly to action because circumstances had required it, and she had made a private decision some months ago, somewhere between the library and the garden and the desk where she had sat with her hands flat on the wood understanding something she could not call math, that she was not going to do that anymore. Not with the things that mattered most. So she took 4 days. The knowledge arrived on a Tuesday morning before work, in the specific physical way that certain kinds of knowing arrive, without drama, without warning, as a clear and unmistakable fact presenting itself to a body that had already known for longer than the mind had. She sat with it for an hour. She went to work. She came home that evening and sat in the window seat of the east room and looked at the wild garden and let the fact be fully real before she did anything else with it. She thought about her mother, who had left without explanation, and her father, who had loved his daughters completely and managed almost everything else poorly. She thought about what a family could be when it was built deliberately rather than arriving as a consequence of other decisions. She thought about what she wanted and whether wanting it was enough reason to reach for it. By the end of the first day she had her answer to that question. The second day she made the appointment with the estate physician. Not for confirmation, though she had clinical training and she had already reviewed the indicators with the attention that training had given her. She made the appointment because she wanted the fact to exist in documentation, to be real in the world before she told anyone. She went to the appointment. She received the confirmation. She thanked the physician, whose name was Dr. Morton, by his full name, which she had noticed people in this house often forgot to do in the efficiency of moving through their days. She walked back across the estate grounds in the thin November light and sat on the bench near the east garden for 20 minutes. She thought about Clara, and about Caden, and about the specific kind of fear she was carrying and what it was actually made of. She identified it clearly. The fear was not about Caden's response. She had spent 15 months learning to read him past every surface he presented, and she was certain of his response in the same way she was certain of the documented evidence in the council chamber, because she had done the work of understanding it. The response would not be calculation. The fear was subtler than that. She was afraid of becoming, in any part of his thinking, a means to something rather than a person he had chosen. She had come here as a bloodline specification. She had moved, over 15 months, into something else. But the bloodline specification still existed in the archive. And she was now, in the most literal biological sense, demonstrating the thing that the specification had been concerned with. She needed to see his face before he had time to think about what it meant. Before any arrangement could form in the space between receiving the news and responding to it. She needed the pure unmanaged first moment of it, because that was the only moment that could not be arranged. She told Clara first. She called early the next morning, knowing Clara would be in the university courtyard between lectures. Clara answered on the first ring. Something has happened, Clara said. Yes, Lina confirmed. What followed was not easily summarized. Clara was not a person who separated her emotions into tidy distinct categories. Joy and surprise and concern and excitement arrived simultaneously, and she expressed all of them at once in a way that Lina found, as she always found it, both exhausting and deeply comforting. Are you all right? Clara asked, when the initial flood had settled. Yes, Lina said. Actually yes. Does he know? Not yet. When are you going to tell him? Tomorrow, Lina said. I need today to make sure I know exactly what I am looking for when I do. Clara was quiet for a moment. You have always read situations correctly, she said. Even when you didn't want to know what you were reading. I know, Lina said. That is what I am relying on. She spent the rest of that day going through her work with complete attention. She met with Oliver. She signed 3 documents. She attended a brief meeting with Diane about an upcoming visit from a neighboring territory's representative. She was entirely present for all of it. In the evening she sat in the library for the last time before she told him. She did not have the book. She sat in the window seat with the lamp off and looked at the front gate and thought about the 2 in the morning 6 months ago when he had sat across from her and said his mother could not sleep either, and that had been the first personal thing he had told her, and she had not pushed on it and he had not explained it further, and both of them had understood what the moment was. She thought about the morning she had found the park payments. The flowers that had been in her room on the first night and had continued, in varying forms, to appear in her room at significant moments throughout the months. She thought about 15 months of small deliberate things that a person does not do for a transaction. She was sure of him. She had been sure for some time. The 3 days she had taken to say yes to the renegotiation had not been about being sure. They had been about something else. This was the same. She went to bed. She slept, which she did not always manage. She woke on Tuesday morning and was completely certain. She waited until the afternoon, when the light in the study was good and the formal part of his day had settled and he was in the specific register she wanted, present but not performative, working but not closed. She walked in. He was at the window. He turned. She went to the center of the room. I need to tell you something, she said. He set down what was in his hands. She said it plainly, with no approach and no softening, the way she said everything that mattered. I am going to have a child. Your child. The room held the words. He was completely still. She watched him with every bit of attention she had, past the surface, past the composure, all the way into the place where the unmanaged truth lived. She was looking for the calculation. The rapid restructuring. The shift from receiving to assessing. She did not find it. What she found was this: his face changed in a way she had not seen before and could not have imagined from the outside. Something enormous and quiet moved through it, the way a slow tide moves, not breaking, not dramatic, just undeniable. The controlled surface that had been his default expression for 15 months dissolved in a way that was not distress but its opposite. As though he had been holding something tightly for a very long time and had just understood that he was allowed to put it down. He sat down. She had never once seen him sit down without the intention to sit. He sat down the way a person sits when the decision has been made somewhere below conscious thought. He put both hands flat on the desk. He looked at the space between them, not at her, not away, but at the space that contained both of them, and his face was doing something she finally had a word for. Not joy. Larger than joy, and quieter. The specific look of a person who has been hoping for something so carefully, for so long, with such complete and private discipline, that the arrival of it requires a moment simply to believe. She stood where she was and let him have it. He looked up at her. When did you know? He asked. 6 days ago. He absorbed this. The timeline settling. Why did you wait? He asked. Not with hurt. With genuine curiosity, the kind that wants to understand rather than to judge. She told him the truth with complete simplicity. I needed to see your face before anything else got there, she said. Before any arrangement or consideration or decision. I needed it to be just the two of us and just the fact, and I needed to see what you looked like in the first moment of it. He was quiet. And, he said. And I have my answer, she said. He stood. He crossed the room and stopped close to her and looked at her, not with any of the managed distances of the months before, not with any surface, and the expression on his face was the most honest thing she had seen from him, which was saying something considerable given how honest he had become over 15 months of working to earn her trust. I want to end the renegotiation, he said. The terms we have been writing. All of it. Every document. His voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of someone holding something that matters greatly very carefully. I want to ask you something different. I want to ask you, without any contract in the room, without any formal arrangement between us, whether you will stay. Not because an agreement requires it. Because you choose it. She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the first day in the study, when she had said she did the math, and she had watched something move across his face that she had not known how to read yet. She thought about the library and the flowers and the park payments and the briefings and the hearing and the garden and the 9 days and the entrance hall. She thought about 15 months of being seen, accurately and consistently, by someone who had stopped doing anything else when she entered a room. Give me 3 days, she said. He nodded, and there was no performance of patience in it. Just the genuine article. The real thing that he had been giving her since the very beginning, every time she had asked for it. She went upstairs. The 3 days were the most deliberate 3 days of her life. On the first day she sat alone in the library in the morning and took a complete inventory of who she was when she was most genuinely herself. Not who she performed. Not who circumstances had required her to be. The actual version. She was 25 years old. She was precise and she was direct and she was capable of enormous care that she had spent most of her life rationing carefully because the people she gave it to had not always known what to do with it. She was good at things that mattered and she had spent a long time in rooms where that was not recognized and she had stopped needing the recognition but had not stopped noticing its absence. She thought about who she was in this house, in this row, in these 15 months. She thought about whether that person was more or less herself than the person who had sat in a kitchen with a white envelope doing math about a transaction. She was more herself. Significantly more. The work was real. The relationships were real. The life she had built here, one small deliberate thing at a time, was the most genuine life she had lived. On the second day she called Clara again. Not for advice. To share it. Clara listened this time more than she spoke, which was unusual and which told Lena that Clara understood this was a different kind of conversation than the previous ones. You sound different, Clara said. I know, Lena said. Good different. Yes. Are you sure? Clara asked. She meant it fully, not whether she was sure about the practical answer but whether she was sure in the deep way that made the practical answer mean something. Yes, Lena said. I am sure in all the ways. On the third morning she walked the garden one more time. All the way to the far end and back, slowly, looking at the things that had been planted where they could grow toward what they needed without crowding what was next to them. George was at the far end, walking. He nodded at her when she passed. She nodded back. She walked back inside. She came down the main stairs the next morning before the household had properly begun its day. The entrance hall was quiet. The light was the early gray kind that belongs to mornings before the sky has committed to anything. He was there. Near the window. Turned toward the glass. He turned when he heard her on the stairs, and she watched him turn and she thought, he knew when I was coming because he has learned the sound of me in this building and that is not a small thing, that is not a transaction thing. That is the specific accumulated knowledge of someone who has been paying attention for a very long time. She stopped on the bottom step. Yes, she said. Not for any reason outside herself. Not because a situation had arrived at a place where yes was the only available option. Because she was a person who had done the work of understanding what she wanted, had been honest about it, had been given the time to arrive at it completely freely, and had arrived. He crossed the hall. He stopped in front of her and she looked at his face, and the last managed distance was entirely gone from it, not stripped away by the situation but released voluntarily, the way you release a thing when you are finally certain it is safe to put down. She stepped down from the bottom step and stood with him at equal height. She placed her hand flat against his chest. He covered it with his own and held it there, and neither of them moved, and the house woke up quietly around them the way houses do, and the garden outside the window was coming into the morning, the carefully wired and deliberately placed and long-tended thing, exactly as it had always been. "We should write something," she said. "Not a contract." "What would you like to call it?" he asked. She thought about it for a moment, genuinely. "We will figure it out," she said. "Together." At the table. His face did the thing that she had 15 months of context for and would spend the rest of her life continuing to learn. Something that was not precisely a smile but contained everything a smile was supposed to contain, and was better for containing it without performing it. She thought she had exactly the right amount of time to learn every version of it. She thought she was going to use every bit of that time well. Outside, the garden held its shape in the growing light. The wild things and the placed things and the growing things, all of it together, exactly where it was supposed to be.